Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of the Disgustingly Resilient podcast. This one's a little bit different. It's just me, Will, doing a solo one. Sort of revisiting an older series that I did kind of when Disgustingly Resilient was sort of in its infancy at this point now, I guess, because obviously the channel's grown quite exponentially thanks to all you guys. And, I'll recap on what the series is and explain. This series might not be for everyone, in the sense this series is more for your mid-table player who's trying to get, maybe he's a little bit higher up the rankings, maybe start pushing those sort of 4-1s, and just sort of like improve. Maybe sometimes at the basics, but also just kind of being a bit more sort of reflective as a player and sort of looking back at the things you could have done better. Obviously, we've got Aidan on the channel who, smashes it at events and kind of showing people what to do right and talking about, his decisions and how his decisions have sort of, led to big wins, 5-0s, 4-1s, almost at a regular basis. If Aidan gets a 3-2, the world ends, whereas if I get a 3-2, that's kind of what I'd be aiming for, and then sort of trying to push higher and push into that 4-1 bracket. Obviously, Dave on the channel is kind of probably more around myself in terms of, where he is as well. But largely because I think Dave isn't is able to get to as many tournaments as me and Aidan, just with sort of family commitments and stuff like that. So the context, just around kind of like me as a player and sort of, where I am and why this series kind of started. So this series started, I think it was, possibly even 2 years ago now. It was quite a while ago. Maybe a year ago, I'm not actually sure without looking at dates. But the idea was, I started 10th and went to a couple of tournaments, and it just became quite apparent I just didn't really have a grasp of the new edition. I didn't know what half the cards were. The list that I built didn't quite function the way I sort of thought it does, and I was trying to put a lot of 9th edition sort of things into 10th, which weren't really sort of working. So I started the sort of Poxwalker at Plague Me Safe to sort of evaluate the games that I played, try and focus on the moments where games went against me, and even if a game I'd won, trying to focus on pitfalls, things that could have sort of gone wrong, to sort of potentially, or things that made it a close game it didn't need to be, those kind of decisions, trying to take dice out of the equation and sort of look at movement and things like that, positioning, deployment, those kind of things. Obviously everyone's had that game where the game's hinged on one particular dice roll. You didn't get the roll you needed, and it was a loss. Sometimes those games, of course, are completely fine. If you're against maybe it's a faction that's deemed to be like a more powerful army, and you have been the underdog, and you've played your skin out, played out your skin to make it a really close game, and that the fact it came down to a dice roll was testament to how well you played. Because perhaps on paper that should have just been a the opponent just blowing you out, and the rock paper scissors element of what is Warhammer 40,000. Some armies are just hard counters to other armies, or some builds of armies. For example, we have a couple of builds as Death Guard that just shut down armies like World Eaters and things that don't bring any guns at all. We can just we can make it almost impossible for them to win the game if we build to do that. Obviously, those kind of anti-sort of combat skews, then leave those builds sometimes open to gun lines, because the idea is you bring loads of, combat units that either have fight first or lots of combat debuffs, -1 to hit, -1 to wound, -1 damage, stack them all on the same unit, those kind of things. But the reason that I've sort of revisited this series isn't to talk about a specific event or to try and drill down on one specific instance, but I thought it'd been a while, and I thought maybe to do like a 2024 sort of recap. Obviously last year's ITC season's finished. I haven't looked at where my placing was, but I don't think it would be very high within the faction rankings, certainly not within the overall rankings of every player and every faction. Majority of last year was 3-2s. I had a little run where I was pushing 4-1s, and that kind of is going to be something we're going to loop back to over the course of this podcast. But I want to sort of talk more about, I think some of the decisions. I think one of the things I got a bit caught up with was changing my list a little bit too often. I made changes because I was looking at other people's list, seeing other people, maybe he's doing better than I was, or I perceived that their list, looked stronger. I felt it would be easier to get a good result with that list, compared to what I was running. And I started, I think, chopping and changing between lists a little bit too much. And I can pinpoint the exact couple of moments where this happened and how I've just sort of got carried away with it, I think, and I should have sort of slowed down, thought about what was working well, what wasn't working well, and tried to play a list that I was comfortable with, so I could focus on, getting better at the game and not playing games where the whole time I was evaluating the list and not really focusing on the sort of the strategy of the game too much, because I was too busy evaluating, is this unit right, is that unit better, should I just have a different list altogether, instead of, right, what could I do with this list, what changes could I made in this game, so when this system comes with next time with this same set of units I can do better, perhaps not make the same mistakes. And then if things didn't go well, oh right, I need to change the list again, where actually perhaps the list was okay, but it was me as a player that made those mistakes. So I think that's something that I wanted to sort of focus on with the point of this video and talk about the grander scheme of Warhammer, because I think there's a lot of people out there, and this is why I'm saying this video might not be for everyone, the people who are already pushing the 4-1s on a regular basis and, sort of trying to rival Aiden, someone who can push a 5-0 and, actually win a GT with Death Guard, or, be on the top tables at the final round of a super major with Death Guard, etc, etc, etc. So as I say, for those people, maybe there'll be some useful stuff in here, maybe there'll be some self-reflection that you can sort of take on board and apply to your own list. Maybe there's something that's held me back from sort of pushing into the 4-1 bracket, that's holding you back from going into the 5-0 bracket. Perhaps that's something. So I guess the best place to start is maybe sort of talk about how last year went. So last year sort of started, I think I had a couple of RTTs. So I basically continued with the list I'd sort of wrote at the start of this kind of Poxwalker Plague Marine series, and that was something that I ran at the start of 2024. So to recap on that, I'm not going to put all the lists in the description of the video, because again, the actual lists themselves aren't really the focus of this. It's more the kind of the thinking and maybe it's holding on to things a little bit too long. Also, why some lists were just wrong. There's one list in particular that was just a bad list, and that all feeds back into this. But the list was 30 Plague Marines, 4 units of 5 and 1 unit of 10. The 10 man, of course, having the fight first, and the Biologist Putrefier to give the lethal hits on 5s, which is the staple. With combat on my 10 man. I know other people do this as well, and I've done it since this sort of combo has come out with the Tallyman and the Foul Blight Spawn. I just think the extra attacks on the bubonic weapons are more meaningful, in the sense of sometimes just hitting on 4s with the heavy plague weapons. Sometimes you just don't roll enough 4s, and it can be a bit, you can get caught out by it, whereas the little weapons, depending on what target you're into, it can add up and push, maybe 4 or 5 extra wounds, so that could be meaningful. So that was the kind of the core of the list, 30 Plague Marines in 3 Rhinos. Now, originally this list had all the Plague Marines, the 5-mans, with exactly the same weapons, and that was 2 heavy plague weapons on 2 of them, 2 of the general guys, and then the champion takes a heavy plague weapon to make 3 heavy plague weapons in the squad. Champion then takes a plasma gun, then there's another plasma gun on one of the guys, and then a plague spewer. I actually tried swapping the plasma gun on the second guy to a melter gun, because I'd seen some people were doing that. I actually found it wasn't, the melter gun's one shot was rarely popped off enough to do anything reliable, and actually more often than not I wanted to overcharge the plasma guns, and the way Hazardous works, I found having the second plasma gun in the squad was more useful. So that way, if I did roll a 1, it was the generic guy that died, and then the champion was still there, keeping the third plague weapon in the squad. So you could rapid fire with the plasma gun, mainly to put the damage 2 on, say, a 5-man unit of Space Marines, say intercessors, to get some wounds through on them. Maybe you chip 2 or 3 of them die, probably 2 of them realistically, from shooting. You roll your hazardous, you lose a guy, then you charge them, but you've still got 3 plague weapons to hit and try and kill the remainder of the intercessor squad that I give as an example in that. So I found that was just more efficient to make them. Obviously, there are still subjective, elements of this, but that was the thinking behind that. Now, I'll sort of pause into one of the sort of developments I made with the list and explain why I'd done that, because it kind of keeps it within the context of what I'm talking about. I did later and actually have continued this change, because I've gone back to 30 Plague Marines, which is the thing we're also going to talk about at the end of the video, what I'm running now and why. And what I've done is I've got 2 of the Plague Marines squads, 2 of the 5-mans with just the bubonic weapons. Now the bubonic weapons I actually found are better into certain matchups, where sometimes, say for example, Sisters of Battle would be a great example when they were sort of prevalent in the meta. Also some Necron units, maybe flayed ones as well, could be a good example. I'm trying to think of other stuff that you kind of see, and then actually even 2 gargoyles or something like that is another good one as an example as well, actually, where hitting on 3s instead of hitting on 4s with an extra attack is generally better into those targets that have like a low toughness, low being like toughness 4 below, because you either still wound them on 3s or sometimes even 2s when you're in combat, obviously of course reducing their toughness by 1 to being contagion, because the strength of the weapon is 5. I actually thought the strength of the weapon was 6 for a short period, and was rolling that wrong, but that was something I spotted quite a while ago. It's just something to sort of bring in, because I might have said it on previous videos, for people who followed this series way back when the last episode came out like 8 months ago or something. So I just found like the bubonic weapons are just better into those targets. So what I would do is I would put a Rhino with one with the heavy plague weapon squad and one with the bubonic weapon. You can put a bubonic weapon on the champion as well, by the way. That's something that I didn't realise that most people weren't aware of. So you basically, with the bubonic weapons, you have 12 attacks just from those guys, hitting on 3s, and then often wounding on 2s or 3s, still with lethal hits on 6s, and then it's AP2 still, so you're still pushing a lot of damage through with them. So say for example it's 5 Sisters of Battle bodies, that's generally enough to kill them on average dice. 2 gargoyles, fair play, they say 10 in the unit, and say they're full health before you charge in. Obviously you've still got the plague spear in there, and plasma guns, you've probably tipped a couple off, but it's 12 attacks there. And then also with that one, the 6 attacks from the normal guys who might have 1 or no AP or -1 save depending on the contagion. It adds up and means that you can sort of chew through those kind of units as well. So I started sort of put in one of the 5-mans of each, so one with heavy plague weapons, one with plague weapons. That way, sometimes the list players, we just put 5 guys on a point. The 5 guys stand there, and all they do is they deny a turn of primary. So I would generally use the weapon that was least meaningful in that match or that instance, because heavy plague weapons are also good into sometimes like a Lehman Russ or something like that. Obviously not to take it down from full bracket unless you are thinking some dice miracle happens, but say you've shot it with stuff and it's left on 4 or 5 wounds, it's not unrealistic to think that the heavy plague weapons could clear it, and they're more likely to do it than the bubonic weapons. So but say depending on what you're up against, sometimes one just stands there, denies primary, and the other one might engage and actually roll dice to try and kill it. I found that was actually better, to sort of like make the list a bit more kind of tailored, I guess, or tailored without being tailored in the sense it can tailor within the matchup. Obviously, if I was to tailor properly, all 4 would be the same, if you can, but then you're sort of very sort of geared up for specific matchups. But anyway, that was one of the things that I sort of learned, sort of playing it. So that was one thing, not to get lost in it. And then there was 3 War Dog Carnivores and 3 Predator Destructors. And they, I found, have been very good synergy. The Carnivores push forward, the Predators stand at the back, and then you generally sort of like, you offer your opponent a choice where which one do you want, people generally can't deal with both at the same time. So you kind of you sort of can put pressure on people in that sense. I did find in a lot of games that sometimes 3 carnivores was a little bit too much, in the sense of sometimes you couldn't really charge the carnivores in. For example, like Deathwing Knights, no way do you ever want to charge a carnivore into Deathwing Knights unless the game is going into a full unit of Deathwing Knights, unless the game is going horribly wrong, and you're just really looking to get lucky with stuff. It's not that the carnivore can't kill the Deathwing Knights, but between the way their inruns work, you might kill 2 or 3 out of, say, like a 5 or 6 man squad, and I don't know if they can take 5 or 6s, by the way. But the point I'm trying to make is the carnivores sometimes weren't the most. They were useful. They were really good at punching through some stuff, but sometimes the third one was just one too many. You kind of would end up running around like a headless chicken, either just sort of to stand on a point, and it is an expensive way to put OC on a point, or in firefights, it just I wouldn't be able to return fire as well. But the Predators and the Carnivores did, they were sort of staples of the list, for a long time. 3 units of Cultists, just to push forward. And then a unit of Nurglings came in or out of it at different points, depending on how viable or relevant I felt they were, or, if some the points could be spent better elsewhere. And then I settled on a Tallyman as well, actually, which I found really useful, because I found often the list's problem was it was very geared at like focus for fighting for primary and kind of primary denial, because there's so much OC in it. The list generally just gets tabled at the point where it outscores people. The Tallyman sort of helped me, because often in those games I'd find if I did lose, it would be like I'd have scored 5 or 10 points more than my opponent on primary, but they would have scored way more than me on secondaries, because I didn't have units in places to sort of deny primary and score a secondary. So I found that the Tallyman, just the 2 or 3 CP gains, over the course of a game, I generally just keep it and use it to redraw stuff, redraw cards, and just have a better chance of keeping the score up. And actually, that was often enough to push me over and turn small loss into small wins. So it was quite a niche thing, because that list is so focused on doing a certain thing. So the reason I've talked about this is I'm going to go back to something similar to this, because I think that's the list I've enjoyed playing the most out of all of it, but it's not necessarily where I finished. So I ran that list. I went 4-1 at Manchester GT with it, and then I had a really weird game situation with it at another GT where I went 3.5, and in the final round was playing for first or second place in the GT. I think I might have talked about it on a previous episode. I don't know if I did a proper breakdown. Played Grey Knights, and I just had in my head some really old hot takes from right at the start of 10th. Thought I had a better grasp of the faction, and just fell into every trap, and everything that could go wrong just went wrong, and it was a complete disaster of a game. The game that wasn't the list, though, I sort of talked about it a bit, thought about it. That result was really bad, especially when it was a top table result. I was going from playing from second in the tournament to be like an absolute. I scored like 30 points in the game because I just gave him my army and was pretty much tabled in 2 turns. I played practice games with it since, taught to team members who also play Grey Knights, and actually was able to get the differential quite close, and even sometimes pip it by a couple of points. It's always a rough matchup for me, the old Grey Knights attachment, that is. And then I'll start linking it to sort of games now. So I'd done that, and I think I had a couple of other events where I was pushing 4-1s. I'd already had my 3-1 going to the final round, and 4-1 was on the cards, and that was getting quite a regular thing. I started to notice a trend. In hindsight, I didn't notice this trend at the time, but the trend with that list, and this is something that I need to focus on, sort of going back to it. The trend with that list was I generally have a 3-2, not in the bag, but like quite kind of comfortably with the list. But the where I would get the 4-1 is the purge mission, because the list, as you might have noticed me running through it, has got a lot of units. on Purge, especially going into some armies like Necron Hypercrypt, maybe some Custodes builds, other armies just have bring big tough bricks. The primary denial doesn't really work in it, and to engage in a sort of like a killing fight, I can. The list has a surprising amount of damage. Like the Plague Marines do hit quite hard for their points, but the problem with the Plagues, they hit hard and they generally die. Once they're out the Rhino, unless they've killed so much, and that people don't have to slap back to be meaningful. Generally, the Plague Marines are, often a once and done unit. So in those kind of games, maybe the board state ends where actually neither of us have got many units left, but I had so many more units to kill. They got to kill more, most turns, if not every turn, and that's how I would lose the game. So I think looking at that, that's something that I would need to address, because you see lots of people like Innes Wilson doing quite well with that Blood Angels list, the one I think he got to the final of Nottingham GT with, and might have took a version of LVO, which just had loads of little Space Marine units. So it's not like people can't sort of play on Purge and win with the kind of MSU sort of type builds. It can be done. Those players have proved it on multiple occasions. So it's down to me to sort of learn to replicate that and adjust my play style more for Purge the Foe, rather than sort of trying to play, because I always catch myself I have to put the Plague Marines on my expansion objective, so the 10 fight first there, and I'm like, half the time in Purge that doesn't matter, because you hold one, generally the middle isn't held. In your turn, how much they're going to hold, so you just put the same on for that moment, and then no one gets hold more until maybe it's the final turn. So like taking those things into account and realising that on Purge is something where I need to look and learn. But yeah, so I noticed with the trend that I would generally lose on Purge, and then sometimes lose, on the rest of the run to like an even skilled or higher skilled player on a much better faction. Like say like a top of the meta build. Generally, I'd noticed that's what had gone wrong over the course of the 3-2s. When I look back, it's it's losing on Purge because my list it's much harder to play on that mission, and then losing once to a better player, which player skill is part of that as well. And that's for me to sort of overcome maybe being the underdog on terms of the factions and sort of outplay them. And I noticed that I did quite well with that one particular build, largely because after events I'd often catch myself trying to break the list down and trying to where can I prove, what can I take, what can I put in, and generally it was quite fixed. There was maybe 100 points to 150 that could kind of wiggle around a little bit depending on balance status, late changes and stuff like that, but it generally stayed quite the same, and I was getting much better results. I was going into games, I was focusing a lot more on what my opponent's army did, how they deployed, how I could do it, and then I started making some changes. Now, one of these happened, so I can think of two moments where this went wrong. One is I went to a GT in Leeds and I just caught myself out. I had a couple of losses. I didn't actually play a second game, not because of anything to do with the event. The event and people I played were amazing. It was more just Leeds isn't the easiest to get to from Manchester, and the journey going home, there was just a lot of pissheads. Drunk people on the train who would do my head in, and the train, did the classic, broke down halfway back, and by the time I got back it was dead late, and I had to do the whole journey the next day. It's like an hour and a half of public transport plus half an hour of travelling between different transport spots, and at that point the best I get was a 3-2, and I was just a bit drained by it. But the games I played, I was evaluating the list and trying to think, because we had a teams event coming up shortly afterwards, and we actually came third in this team event, not through me, to be fair, but I'll talk about that in a second, because this is where I started to sort of go off a cliff a little bit, shall we say. At this point, people in my team, were sort of like, I can notice the way they were talking to me, the way people were playing, when people want to try and listen to be one of the people, like we do team event, people were like, I was sort of, almost guaranteed to be in the starting lineup, because at the time I was getting one of the better results on the team. And traditionally, and this is something that I needed to change, I've generally played on teams through free tickets because I live very close to Element Games. There's a lot of like teams events there, and the way teams works is, if you're a man down on a team, it's a big deal. So some of the TOs who run the teams event, they have like a list of local players who, they can message on the morning or the night before, such and such a team's had, someone's got food poisoning, it's unexpected, he's not going to be able to play it tomorrow, they just need a player to turn up and play anything. Do you want a free ticket? Yay or nay. And, sometimes I'd accept it. And it kind of mean I'd often be like the runt of the litter, should we say, sometimes on teams of good teams, sometimes on teams of just mates. But the reason I'd be runt of the litter would be, I wasn't part of their team composition. And often they would just throw me into whichever list that no one else wanted to play. And I'd get kind of wrecked. Like, that's a lot of the times when I caught playing Team England players, it's because of these teams of them where I've been the one who's been sort of thrown under the bus playing Josh Roberts, Mike Porter. I'm trying to think some of the other people. I think it's Josh Roberts like 2 or 3 times, Matt Robinson, other people of there, never Manny Chima, but like those kind of players, because I was I was just filling in the numbers as far as they were concerned, and they kind of felt that player's likely to 20 anyone they play, so may as well be me. So that's meant my attitude to teams has kind of been a bit different to more. So I've taken them as an opportunity to run a list that I'm not sure about taking at singles. Maybe it's trying something a little bit weird, a little bit wacky, and kind of, doing it in the sense it doesn't really matter, which in hindsight is not the way to look at teams. And I realised this at this particular event, if I'm to be totally blunt and honest, and I've never really even told this to members on my team, because so basically what I did, I wanted to write a list, and it was something that I would deliberately change this list. Now I wanted the core of it to be the same, and the reason things to the Leeds thing, by the way, sorry, I missed that link there, it's because at the Leeds game I felt if I had PBCs in the list I might have done better. So obviously teams, it kind of makes sense to have PBCs, because the people in the team, they did say I could just run my same list if I wanted to. They weren't really bothered. But if we could work some PBCs, and it would be quite good, because it works in the team's format a bit better, brings something kind of unique to the list, and gives Deathguard its kind of place to be there. So I was, more than happy to do this. And originally I thought, well, I'll just drop the 3 Predators for Plague Burst Crawlers, and then, just the points, to try and fit them in. And then I just sort of, instead of doing this, I think I had to drop a Carnivore for a Brigand and a couple of like chaff units or something. But I could kind of pretty much get the 30 Plague Marines, 3 Plague Burst Crawlers, I think 2 Brigands and a Predator, and then it was like maybe 2 squads of Cultists and not 3. Something like that. I had to drop some stuff, and obviously drop Nurglings here in there as well. I think I had to drop them. So there was stuff like that where it wasn't that thing. Now, and I tested that list a couple of times and had close games into people, and the list itself was fine, especially because it's at the point where Plague Burst Crawlers could still hit on 2s with all the buffs and all this thing. Now, I didn't work all the buffs in that everyone else has. I just kind of rolled mine raw, just sort of hitting them on 4s, which again was a mistake. When I looked, I realised after playing the list a little bit, kind of like what it needed. But I ended up writing this list and just starting to just make changes that I wanted to try, things I wanted to see what would happen. Ended up with like half a Plague Bush. I had like 1 Sorcerer, 1 fight for 1 Foul Blight Spawn. The Foul Blight Spawn's maybe going to attach to 5-man Plague Marines. It was just loads of like weird stuff from 20 Plague Marines, and then I had some like other weird units in there that I thought would like help me hold primary. But I refused to drop the 3 Carnivores. So in fact, I could get 3 Plague Burst Crawlers, 2 Carnivores, and a Predator. I ended up dropping the Predator, then trying to like force 10 points extra in somewhere. Like, I think, just took a unit out that made a lot more sense to kind of force into sort of try changing stuff. And now the teams event, we did okay, and to be honest, my results weren't that bad. I drew with Thousand Suns, and Thousand Suns were pretty brutal round 1. I did beat Necrons when Necrons were really, really rough in the meta with the Wraith build, because it was kind of like this time. I drew with Sisters. I can't remember how good or bad Sisters were at that point, because I know before their index came, it was kind of like one or two particular builds and one or two particular players doing well, rather than Sisters as a faction. I lost horribly against Vortan, because the list just didn't, it just didn't ever function the way I wanted it to function and how I thought. And then now after this teams tournament, instead of sort of like just going back to what I'd run, I continued with this just chopping and changing stuff, and then just kept doing different things. I decided, 2 10-man Plague Marine bricks, and then no 5-man Plague Marine units, and then the 3 Predators, the three Carnivores, and just kind of like stuff that just changed how the list functioned, but then just keeping trying to play it the way that I was playing it with the 5 Plague Marines, of trying to deny primary. I even threw some bloke drones in, I think, in one version, which again just didn't really function in my head the way that I thought they would. And I think the error that I made was, instead of trying to like change my play style to sort of like what was in the list and trying to sort of like adjust in that way, I tried to sort of like play the list the way that I'd got used to playing when I've been having success with it, and basically trying to force a square peg into a round hole is probably the best way to do it. And I think the more I did this, the more confused I got, the more change I made, the more restless I got with the list, and I think it just kind of spiraled and went down a bit of a rabbit hole where you start to look at other people's lists, especially the podcast. When we look at this that Peter done well, oh, that list looks really cool, oh, it looks really exciting, trying to break down what they've done. But then, rather than just net list their whole thing, where maybe it's a couple of small changes and run it that way, and then try and adjust my play style, I take 2 or 3 little bits and shoehorn it into this other list that already wasn't working. And he ended up with just a list of just a little bit of everything and a lot of nothing, and not enough player skill or not the right idea of how it plays to sort of make it a reality. Now, don't get me wrong, I still got 3-2. So I think every event, there was only one event where I didn't go 3-2, and I can't remember why. I think it was a Lords of War one in Bolton where I remember the final game against Chaos Knights. I was actually, when I was on stream round one, it was in Space Wolves with the 2. I had the 2 10-man Plague Marines, and I just made some poor decisions. And in that game, I lost against Eldar as well. Actually, it was a really weird loss, the one against Eldar. The guy actually thought I'd won, but then he's not a newer player, but he doesn't play as regularly, and he was happy to put it all in the point above. But I'd noticed he hadn't scored primary at the end of the turn. He'd give his primary at the start when he was on like 1 objective, but at the end he was on 3. And part of me was like, oh, I could just take the win here and shut my mouth, and sort of like maybe a lot of people would have done that. I certainly know people who would have done that, because a few people said I should have done play skill in their opinion is knowing how the scoring works. If you don't know how to score a game and you think your opponent's going to win, that's you've lost the game because that's play skill. I don't think it is, to be honest. I don't agree with that. So as much as he was like starting to type into BCP, I was like, look mate, no, you've won this is why, and showed him, and he's like, oh, all right, yeah, nice one, I really appreciate it. I was no, it's really it's a way to do. So I was a bit frustrated that I'd lost that, because I misunderstood something in the game that had kind of like put a big point swing into it. I held an objective when I didn't realise it, because one of his units had more OC than I thought it did, because at the start he'd been talking if everything's OC1 apart from this OC2, and I think they must have been next to each other in the box or something, and when he pointed, I thought he pointed at the wrong unit. So had I realised, I could have just spent 1 CP to auto pass a morale, but I rolled the morale. Then as I rolled it, kind of like, hang on, what's the OC? Put my hand on the dice, but we both see what the dice was, because I wanted to sort of like no one see the dice and not me, and like, because the question, because I had a sudden like just something like, well, pop my hand on, is that, do I definitely not hold this? But then we both saw the dice, and then I asked him, and he said, oh, and I was like, oh mate, can I just auto pass this morale? And he's like, oh, and I was like, look, I saw the dice too, mate, like there were 5, but I would have auto passive and new, and I tried to put my hand up, and neither of us saw the dice, because I realised, I mean, he was like, well, we've seen the dice now. I was like, do you know what, mate, it's fair play, like, from his point of view, it probably did look like I'm just trying to call it based on what I'd seen, and maybe if the boots had been, a boot would be on the other foot, maybe I would have done the same, maybe I would have been like, look, mate, like, you can't see your dice and then want to spend the CP, you've rolled them, and if you'd rolled, say I had rolled a 10 and passed the morale, it wouldn't have even, you'd have had a CP for free, you can't have it both ways kind of thing, so that was fair. And then the last round of that, I played Chaos Knights. I wasn't sure how Chaos Knights would go, because the other list that I run through at the start with the 5-man place, it always kind of had a good game in the Chaos Knights. Carnivores kill carnivores. The Predators, can sort of open up with, I can start shooting them before they can get their big guns in range, and the Plague Marines can actually out-or-see them just by standing in front of them. So it's always kind of been never blowing them out, but it's always kind of been a good game. The 10-man Plague Marines can take down a big knight as well, so can a Carnivore if you've got Contagion helping, and the Plague Marines have maybe had some bits softened up for them to sort of make it a bit more reliable. But anyway, and then after that again, I really started evaluating that list, decided that list wasn't right. Now again, I actually stand by that list not being right for me. I think that list works quite well for some people. I'd seen other people do it, but there was too many units doing things that didn't sort of synergize in the way I got used to playing the army. So where did I go after that? And I think at this point I just was a bit lost. I think I started going back to what I talked about at the start, and I had a couple of games with that, and it kind of felt good. I sort of felt like I'd come home a little bit. Sort of it was the most fun, even if I wasn't getting the results. I was a bit rusty with it, but I was starting to sort of beat people in practice games again that I'd previously, been struggling against. I don't know if I took it to a GT or an RTT, but then the Deathshroud thing happened, where the Deathshroud build, and like I say, at this point I was ready to go back to what I'd run, but then the Deathshroud thing, obviously everyone was hyped for it. We talked about it on the podcast. Me and Dave agreed that we'd take identical lists to Leicester, and I thought, why not? To me, that was a way that I could sort of justify doing it, and I thought I'd do it as a one-off, and I did enjoy it. I ran Mike Porter very close. Actually, I didn't think everyone thought I was going to beat him, but he pipped it at the end again on Perth. Now again, that is no real, sort of oh, I'm an amazing player. I can tangle with Mike Porter. It's not really. Mike didn't really understand the list. He's played me before, and it's normally pretty one-sided. I think he assumed that the list did something different, and if he was to play it again, I've since seen him and talked to him, and he basically said, he just played it terribly, and he would never play it like that again, because like a lot of people with the Deathshroud, they realise that you kill the chaff, you leave the Deathshroud, and the Deathshroud hit a point where you can't do anything. They can't very hard to win you the game when the point scoring sort of stuff that can sort of be more mobile on the board is gone. Now, because obviously I ran Mike close, I had another game afterwards where I did sort of take a loss that I think really the dice kind of went a bit nuts for my opponent in that one. It was a combat army that I played into, and obviously the Deathshroud build shuts it down, and he just rolled through all the debuffs in the sense of, well, your orcs are hitting on 5s, pick up 10 dice, roll 7 5s, and I'd be like, okay, hitting on 5s is completely, you can roll 5s, okay, but now you're wounding on 4s instead of 3s, 7 4s, at least I've got a 4+ invuln. I've only made 3 of them, and do you know what I mean? It was one of those games where things that I thought sort of I was going to shut him down. We had a point, but because that had happened, and we kind of, that opponent was willing to even let me have a draw because we didn't quite get the end of the game, and he thought I took a secret mission and stuff, but really there was no way I could win it. So I said, no, I can't win. You have the points, but because those two were both really good sort of top players. A fella called Corn and his Orcs in the last one. People might recognise his story because I've definitely mentioned it on the podcasts. But because they were close games, and I did win the other ones, I sort of convinced myself, okay, we'll keep going with this. This is, this is good. It felt fun. I also, the first RTT I took it to ran Andy QC really close as well with it. Again, people not playing into the Deathshroud properly, people not really understanding what the list did. And then I just sort of hit this thing where I decided that it was like a puzzle, 16 Deathshroud, these specific characters, 2 sorcerers, or 3 sorcerers and Typhus, or 2 sorcerers and Typhus, Mortarion, and then stuff. What's the stuff? I've got to find the stuff. This is but I can crack it. Other people have done well with this. And I think I hit a point where the Deathshroud build had sort of died and people had moved on from it because of the things that we've talked about on the podcast I'm alluding to here. It's a good build, it's a very skewed build, and there are certain factions and builds that opponents can take where it just shuts them down hard. And in those games, if you get paired into World Eaters 3 times, Corn Demons twice, that's you've got a pretty good chance of getting a 5-0, if you get those pairings. But at the same time, you get paired into Tau twice, you get paired into, a Space Marine gun line, and, a couple of other sort of fast moving, high damage, 1,000 Suns that spit out mortal wounds at range where you can't catch them, with your 4-inch moving guys, you can have an equally rough time. I also found the Knights builds were quite bad for it because they had so much OC and were so quick, and you couldn't really kill their resources quick enough because you could kill them in combat, but you had to get to combat. And generally to go, well, you've got 7 OC, I'll just stand the knight there, or you've killed the knight, what a nightmare, but you didn't score any primary either, and I'm holding my expansion objective, which you're still slowly trudging towards, or, you've got to make a 9-inch charge to get there, or, do you know what I mean? It was a lot of stuff like that, but then I wouldn't let go of it, if that makes sense, and I took it to Nottingham, and I think Nottingham was where I really just sort of came to the conclusion, or the accepted the inevitability that I think I pushed it a little bit. I think I needed to just let go of the concept, if that makes sense. I think it's seen its day, shall we say, which I think is the best way to put it. And then obviously we have sort of played teams and things since too. So I mentioned teams. I played another teams tournament since then, and this teams tournament I took. I sort of learnt my lesson, and we were going to take the Deathshroud build, but we realised at Nottingham, don't take the Deathshroud build. It's too. I think for 8-man teams, it probably still has a place where you can be almost certain there's going to be the opponent's going to have a combat build. Maybe she can take Deathshroud and something else, and maybe it's still a place. But in 4 or 5-man teams where there isn't that many pairing control for the people who know about teams, basically the more players you have on a team, the more chance you have of controlling what players play who. The less players, the more random elements there are. So, and also the less chance that your opponent's team has got a list that you want to shut down, and also that they'll fall for sort of letting you play that list with your list. So Plague Storm's been a thing with Nathan Roberts running that. He did really well at Nottingham where I was, and I took so I was like, right, okay, Deathshroud build. We had to YOLO because basically the list cut off was midnight on the Sunday coming back from Nottingham, and I was like, let's do Plague Storm based on Nathan's done really well with it, blah blah blah, let's give it a go. Now I went into the team storm with no reps at all, 0 reps. First time I played it was at that team's tournament, and it's much harder to play that list than what I thought it'd be. I thought it was literally switch your brain off, you put on the board, you blast everything to pieces, and it's your opponent's got nothing left to play the game. But actually it was surprisingly hard to sort of balance playing secondaries, screening, holding primary, and it caught me off guard. And then I could feel myself about to go down the Deathshroud route where it's like, right, okay, I'm going to have to make Plaguestorm work because that's what everyone else is doing, and I can definitely do it. I've got all the models. I just need to think about it. I have to get better as a player. And then now Plaguestorm, there might actually be some viability to that because Plaguestorm's proven well. Aiden did really well with it at Vanguard Tactics on teams, and his list is very similar to Nathan's. I know it is decisively different, and Aiden put his own spin on it, and there was a guy in Germany did well with a version that puts a spin in it as well. So it seems to be that Plaguestorm is definitely very strong, but like I say, it's harder to play than what I thought. And part of me sort of thinks, should I try and play it? Should I push on with it? Should I sort of use it as a chance to improve as a player, get used to playing a gun line? But then I'm also like, well, maybe I should. But I'm getting less games in practice-wise now, and I want to feel more like I'm focusing the game and less like the list. And this 30 Plague Marines thing, with Ryan, has always been, since the start of this edition, the thing I've had the most fun with. The 4 units of 5, a unit of 10, and then, a small shooting contingent behind it, and then sort of like going like along those lines. And I think that's what I want to go back to, basically, because I did also try a list in the middle, actually, before the teams one, when I was trying that team thing. I tried an even weird one that had 2 Predators, 2 Plague Burst Crawlers, 2 Carnivores, before I settled on the actual team one. That I tried that. I took it to an RTT, I think, and again tried to play it like I had the Plague Marines, jumping out of Rhinos, trying to deny primary, and like half of the game I wasn't denying his prime anymore, and I'd used all my chaff units up, and I was completely out of position to do anything more. And then I'd gone from being ahead on the scoreboard to him catching up and then overtaking me on turn 5, which was inevitable because the list didn't play the same way. And it just comes back to this point of like having lists that don't play in a way that I want to play them. Comes down to either I have to adjust and adapt my play style, which could be a good thing, improving as a player, thinking more about the game. But it also could be that I'm better just going back to what I know, and this is the underlying point I'm trying to make in this video. I think for some people out there who are great players and have loads of content, I'm making content, but have loads of games and loads of confidence, confidence, not content, 2 words beginning with C, confidence at the game, and they're able to sort of adapt their play style. That's the same. But for people who are sort of trying to get better, I think finding one list that works and making small tweaks. I know Scary on Scarcast talks about this as well. I think he says you should have at least 18-20 reps of the list before you move past it or something if you think it's good. So I think that's kind of fair here, and this is what I'm going to go back to. I think to sort of close this off. I think rather than try to get sucked into Plaguestorm and go down the same sort of route I went down with the Deathshroud, and admittedly Plaguestorm is different. It doesn't really have. It's not like a flawed list like the Deathshroud in the sense it just has a massive issues that you can't really, because the Deathshroud build felt like a hit points where there was no player skill in elements of it, in the sense of that objective is 7 inches away. There's a unit on the far side of the objective, so I've got 2 options, right? It's either an 8-inch charge that unit after I've moved my 4 inches, and then I'll be able to hold the objective if the unit's dead, or sometimes there's only 3 models in that unit. If I can get onto the objective, or everyone onto the objective, and I'll hold it, but then that's a 3-inch advance, and everything with the Deathshroud build just felt like that. It's like, right, okay, this game's going to go massively in my favour if I make this 9-inch charge from deep strike. Do you know what I mean? Or if I make this 9-inch charge because my opponent's been very wary of how close they want to come to me. They're right in the far edge of the real far back edge of an objective because I had to stand on it. But they know that doing that gives me the longest charge, 9 inches. There's so many times games just came down to rolling advances, rolling charges. I don't know, I think that element just sort of is something that holds the Deathshroud build back. Whereas obviously Plaguestorm, there is a dice element to it. I was talking to someone in the chat, I think the problem for me with Plaguestorm is it hits a point where you are just at the beck and call of the dice as well. The movement's a part of it, but generally you're moving to shoot things and stand places, and you're just at the beck and call. I have to do this hit this many hits, this many wounds, this many saves, what happens? And I know that is 40k. It's how most shooting armies play. I'm just not used to playing a shooting army, which I think is the element. And also, you moving the shooting army in a way where it holds the board, it scores primary, it can deal damage whilst also doing secondaries. They're things that, are all player skill, learning curve things. And like I say, part of me thinks maybe I should embark on that, but I think the reality is I want to go back to the 30 Plague Marines, because I think it's got game into a lot more stuff. The reason I like the 30 Plague Marines build is you can walk into a game and I can have a game plan, So for example, I played a game yesterday and you can put, say the 10 fight first, they go and hold your natural expansion. They can just sit there all game. Some people just won't even, they'll just accept that your expansion is there, and that's all that happens. And then maybe turn 4, turn 5, they can push off and try and get to somewhere else if they need to. And then you can have the other 4 or 5 man Plague Marines all into Rhinos opposite their expansive objective, and each turn just fling a 5 man out on it. Like, it sounds like a really basic tactic, but you'd be surprised at how many times it works, where every turn you just saw, turn 1, primary doesn't matter, right, so turn 2, we'll start this, 5 Plague Marines, 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 and the 10 OC is generally enough to deny it 5 times, and if they do stand something that the 5 Plague Marines can't out OC, generally they can kill it, because a lot of the high OC units in the game are naff, and if you can sort of keep the fight on the objective, sometimes they actually, they find it hard to push in your Rhinos and hold you from getting there, so if you're denying their expansion objective while holding yours, and then you have some shooting lined up across the middle, or you have something that kind of like keeps the middle, where if you come in, it's it's a death zone because I've got a big counter charge there, or some way of clearing off chaff, then your game, my game plan is quite fixed, and in that way it's like, right, before the game even starts, I know what I'm going to do, and blah blah blah, I know I'm going to deploy, and I'm just going to do this nearly every game, and my opponent has to disrupt me, and if they disrupt me, then I have to react, and then that's where my player skill will come in, trying to acknowledge situations that have happened before. Right, okay, so I've been here before. What was that the right thing to do? Is that the right thing? Because sometimes the right thing to do, if people realise what you're doing and they come and push in your deployment zone because they realise they're going down the game, they have to kill all your resources, and sometimes it's right for them, sometimes it's wrong. Then sometimes it's right, okay, I'll expose all, say there's I'll expose all 3 Plague Marines and Rhinos. The 10 man on my home field might expose themselves if they need to, but they generally still don't stay. If there's 2 or 3 carnivores will rush out. If the predators weren't already in a firing lane, they'll all 3 will roll out, and you just unload everything all at once. And sometimes that's you can kind of counter them because the list has a lot of damage in it. So as you can see by talking through this, I think I want to go back to this kind of play thing where I have a game plan, and then I can focus on how they're trying to disrupt it, and then if something's going wrong, how I can adapt it, and not try to learn everything from the ground up, because I'm not getting to play as much Warhammer these days as I was. As a lot of people listening to this will, I used to get 2-3 games in a week sometimes, but now I'm responsible for running a local gaming club where we ensure everyone gets a game, so we put a spare man out. If you're running it, you're the spare man. So if there's uneven numbers, say 7 people turn up, although it's more like 27 to be fair. Obviously you need to be the 28th person, so everyone gets a game. But if 26 people turn up, everyone's already got an opponent, and you just stand and watch. You answer rules questions for a bit, or maybe go and coach one of the games. I say coach, pick whichever one of my mates is playing someone who is maybe a bit new at the game, and help that person, give them a good game. I think I want to go back to this type of list, basically somewhere I don't need as many reps to get sort of familiarised with it, and once I'm familiarised, it'll be a lot of fun to play, I think. So I'll run through what I'm thinking about the most. So there's two lists I think I'm going to return to. And these 2 lists, they're kind of back to the old school in many sense. Now, one thing I would say with the Deathshroud is I have been quite impressed with them, and I think like to leave 6 Deathshroud in the list, because I think they do something that's quite good. I think they shut down combat armies quite nicely as well when you've got your 10 fight first plague marines on one side and you've got them in the middle, because it's the idea is, even though I've always seen them as a unit where you're never going to get the charge off with them. Like, this is the thing I've always seen. They're an anvil, you know, to someone else's hammer. You know, someone charges a big combat unit at them and you go, right, you're -1 to hit, -1 to wound, and then you're -1 damaged, hopefully with the CP on the damage. Do you know what I mean? To do that. Now, so I've got them in the list. So 6 Deathshroud and Typhus. Now, Typhus to me is an odd one, because I see him as an anvil, I can't help but feel the sorcerer is better because of that. But then Typhus brings a lot to the unit. He brings a -1 hit all the time. He can still get -1 damage with a CP. And the -1 wound obviously is also good. So I think Typhus does that, and then obviously offensively he's way better. He also gives them the extra inch of movement, and you know, brings the mortal wounds as well as the damage that he has. So on the whole, Typhus I think probably does make a little bit more sense. But then the sorcerer just kind of like, you don't need 2 CP to do -1 damage. You can still roll a 1, but obviously the odds are against you in that sense. Sorry, pardon me, just clear my throat. But yeah, I don't know. That's one of the things I'm not sure about. But 6 Deathshroud and one of those 2 characters. I've got Typhus in there at the moment because I've got the points to do it. But if I needed to shave 10 points, I think he could drop to a sorcerer and I'd have no problems at all with it. Then I've got the 10 fight first plague marines back to hold my expansion. Now, they're a funny one. I am fully aware that there is whirlwinds and things come back into meta and a lot of indirect. But at the same time, you know, that there's always going to be something that blasts everything. Do you know what I mean? Like the Plague Storm list has got some hard counters as well. You know, some armies just kill armor like it's you know, no effort at all for them. So, you know, every build's got something wrong. So I've just got to accept that, I think. And the 4 5-man plague marines with the weapon lords at a torso. So 1 with heavy weapons, 1 with bubonic. I'm very set on them, and 3 rhinos to transport the plague marines. I think that that set of units is there as a core, and then at least two squads of cultists for the scout, and then a third one wherever I can afford it. And then Nurglings, I'm not sure on. Nurglings I find are really good when they're needed, but a lot of the times you don't need them. I find, you know, like they're a funny old unit, Nurglings. I keep going backwards and forwards on them. On a whole, I do quite like them, especially if I was to put a sorcerer in, but then only if I've got the points. You know, you save 10 points from Typhus to a sorcerer, but then spend 40 points on Nurglings. It all adds to one squad of Deathshroud that stop being so cheap then. But then the Nurglings have other things. Obviously, you can push out sort of screens and people sort of, you know, either getting firing lanes on you, you know, to maybe into your backfield, or to stop someone scouting and being able to get a first turn charge. So they are good, but at the moment I don't think they're in the list that I'm gonna practice next. I've got 2 versions, and now the other one I need a firing base. I'm not sure exactly what the firing base is. I've got 2 options. One is 3 predators, you know, pretty much a staple of Death Guard. But I found on UKTC boards that 2 predators are really good because you can put them in the same firing lane, and you know, across the 2 of them. They're not reliable into like other armor. For example, 2 predators don't seem to kill a Caladius. You know, they might not kill a Lancer. It just depends on how well you roll on your last cannons, that kind of stuff. But 2 generally it's meaningful when they're sat next to each other, both shooting the same target. Getting 3 on UKTC, I found can be really good, but the boards are quite cut in half. You know, it's very hard to shoot from right across one side of the board to the other. So the third one, sometimes having 3 in a firing lane, sometimes it felt either overkill, or I was like leaving one part of the board sort of empty. And then when you say split one predator off to go in another part of the board, sometimes one predator on his own isn't reliable at all. Like, it's not enough the two last cannon shots are not reliably killing a vehicle. The turret gun shots, because of the AP and the strength, they sometimes pop off and pick up something really easily, but there's other times when they just don't. You generally, because you're hitting on threes, sometimes, especially when pots minus one hit or something needs the second to do it. So I do have a version of the list that has 2 brigands and 2 predators. So kind of either, they can either pair up, 1 brigand, 1 predator, or 2 predators, 2 brigands, and kind of have half of the board each. Because one of the reasons this list also as well is primary denial. So the carnivores were a big part of it. The carnivores were a big part because they were just fast OC sometimes. Sometimes they didn't ever charge anything. They were just there running around doing stuff. But then there are also games like where the Imperial Knights matchup or Chaos Knights matchup, they're really good on those kind of instances. Because they're great at killing vehicles that don't have an invuln, they can generally one-turn them quite reliably. As long as you've got something else putting that opponent's unit in contagion, on the assumption it's also -1 to their save. And that also generally means you half the time go from wound on, say, 3s or 4s to 3s or 2s. Normally 4s to 3s, to be honest, with the way the breakpoints work. So the carnivores are the thing I'm iffy on at the moment. Like I'm unsure if it's better to just have more guns, because it is quite nice having shooting. So having the, say, 2 predators, 2 brigands, it's kind of 2 different profiles, but a little bit of anti-tank from both of them. The other option, the other list I'm looking at, I think is the one I'm sort of settled on in my head at least, is 3 predator destructors and 2 carnivores. And now that list to me feels very like there's no fat in it at all. So just to recap, so it's Typhus, Ballad Putrefier, Foul Blight Spawn, and 10 Plague Marines. So and then 6 Deathshroud, 3 squads of Cultists, 5 squads of Plague Marines, 3 Rhinos, 3 Predator Destructors, and 2 War Dog Carnivores. And it's 5 points under. So there's no Nurglings in it. There's 3 squads of Cultists, but no Poxwalkers, because sometimes I take 10 Poxwalkers to stand on home field, so all 3 cults can push into the middle of the board. So that's one option. There's very lean. It's very sort of killy, but then the carnivores can push forwards with the predators still sort of like coming out, hanging around in the backfield. But then I'm back to the shooting issue. I could drop a predator and bring in 2 casters for the plague bus, but again the predator's range is, when I play with just brigands, I found that the range can be a little bit frustrating, to say the least. Then the other version, it doesn't have the carnivores. It has Typhus replaced to a Terminator Sorcerer. And it has 2 predators, 2 brigands. It does have a squad of Nurglings, and it does have a squad of Poxwalkers as well, in addition to all those other units, which they could be cut. They could be a drone of some kind or whatever. Perhaps I'd need to test it, or maybe say cutting the source turns to being Typhus or whatever. But there, I think at the moment, the 2 lists that I'm looking at, they both kind of play a similar concept, as you can tell, and I give the breakdown. But the reason I've done this video is to sort of explain why I've come back to this. It's slightly different, but it's back to the old concept. And I think why I also want to do this video is to sort of like, I think a lot of people, speaking to them, get caught up in this like chasing different lists, and when they lose a game, it's a list, it's not them. But like, I've noticed at this moment, I'm hardly at all focusing on the games afterwards. I'm going to focus on the list and thinking about my list and what could I change. And that brain power should be invested into like, what could I have done? What tactics could I have done? Where could I position this unit? How could I have done that? What can I have done? Because I think previously when I played the list, I was doing things to sort of like make my opponent's game plan hard. Like sometimes I push all the cultists out into the midboard because I know that I need to push out a screen. Sometimes I'd push turn 1 a cultist onto their expansion objective. I deliberately go onto that if I was going first, so they had to do something about it. They couldn't just like stand there. Whereas this time I'm just not doing things like that because I'm too focused on my list and I'm not thinking about how I'm playing it enough. So that's why I want to do this, and I want to also loop back round because I think I want to explain why I've come up with the decisions, and then also kind of helps me commit to the list by talking about them in depth in a video. One of those lists, one either A or B, 2 brigands, 2 predators, or basically either brigands and predators or carnivores and predators. There we go. It's a simpler way to put them. I'm going to run one of them at Manchester. I'm definitely not going to run Plague Storm, as much as it's tempting, and I'm seeing everyone else talk about it in chat and getting hyped and seeing the big results. Rather than try and push myself to do it and then maybe be frustrated at Manchester, I'm going to run one of these lists. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. That's no problem. But Manchester's the next big one. It's the local one. I've gone 4-1 the last 2 years. I don't know if I can go 4-1 again. I feel like that lightning might not strike a third time. But I'm going to try and get reps in with this list. And hopefully this video has been useful. Maybe there's other people can kind of like self-reflect on their own journey, go, oh, maybe I'm doing the same thing, maybe I'm jumping lists too regularly, where actually I should be working on me as a player and the tactics with this set of units. Because there can also be other ways we can hold on to a list for too long. I do understand that, like I did with the Deathshroud build. But I think when you're playing those kind of like, because the Deathshroud build was a meme, let's be realistic about it. It was a meme that, people came out the gates, hot with, and we saw some big results at the start. But the more people got used to playing with it, the less effective it was, and the better players were quick to realise that and move off it. Whereas I was not so quick. But hopefully going back to this, and I think at the moment this feels quite right. This list always has primary, it's always in the game. Yeah, fair play. There are times when it's I'm going to come against something rough and I'm just going to get blown off the board. Bridgehead, Eldar, they are still there, and uneven player skill, they probably should beat me more often than not, just through those armies being so much stronger than any Death Guard build. Well, we can build, but obviously, you go down to skews and trying to skew into one matchup, with the example of the Deathshroud again, skewing to shutdown combat can be a bit risky. I think mixed arms, balanced lists are definitely the way to go. Certainly for me, I think I've realised I like lists where nearly the whole list pushes forwards, with the exception of a small firing base at the back, and then it just sort of pushes through the board. I've really enjoyed doing that. Something that kind of like holds a big brick unit, just holds one bit of the board securely and kind of owns that. I've noticed, and when the Codex comes, I think that's how I'm going to try and take that into building lists. But anyway, so like and subscribe, guys, and thank you very much for getting this far in the video. And I know, as I say, this kind of content isn't for everyone, but I also know from the feedback I had got previously on Poxwalker and Plague Marine, the people who do find it useful find it very useful. So I thought I'd sort of revisit it, kind of more of a summary of last year, kind of how I started at one point looking really good and focusing. I actually started to feel like a 4-1 was on the cards. But another good thing to throw on actually before this video ends, at that point I think I also started having an expectation of myself, and if I went 3-2 I could feel myself getting frustrated, and and if games I didn't win I got a lot more worked up about it. And I don't think I ever became a bad opponent, but there was definitely moments where I was like getting a bit kind of like, this isn't going well and stuff like that. And it's sometimes that's just passion, and everyone does that in a game. But I think I want to sort of focus on sort of like having enjoying the game and having fun. And I think this is the list that'll do it, and also not getting too bogged down with the results. I think when the results come, amazing, but I think the thing to focus on is just getting into position where the result can happen. Like my goal, for example, is always to try and go at a GT 3-2 before the last round, or 3-1 before the last round. So 3-2 is guaranteed regardless of the outcome, but 4-1's on the cards, and then play for that 4-1. And the more often you get in that position and play for the 4-1, the more that it'll come, I guess. But then at the same time, the fact that you didn't get the 4-1, your 3-2 was in the bag, so you can't finish the game and be like, oh, that was terrible, what an awful weekend, but like, it's not an awful weekend, you still went 3-2, you still finished with a positive outcome, so at the end of the game you'd be like, oh, buzzing, I didn't win, but still got my 3-2, so yeah, I'm pretty chuffed with that. So that's what I want to be. But also when it doesn't happen, try and like self-reflect, look at you as a player, as a person, and obviously the point of this has been don't get lost in trying to change your list. Sometimes look at you and see what you could change as a player. But obviously, that's the overarching sort of thing I'm trying to get to. Now, I can feel myself going off on tangents. I said I'd end the video about 10 minutes ago and then continued. So we will bring it to a close. Now, obviously, me, Aidan and Dave have got loads of stuff. We do a pretty much weekly live stream these days on a Tuesday. So where we sort of talk, about the hot topic of the week, or just have a general catch up with chat and the people that are tuned in. Ian has a slew of solo videos, and Dave pops out the odd one too. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe, and we are affiliated with Element Games. So if you are buying any models, feel free to look. Hopefully in the description of this video, if not, certainly in our channel page description, there's a link there where any money you spend, it's an affiliate link. You just go to Element websites like normal. Any money you spend, we get a small kickback. Just helps keep us in models, and especially the codexes coming. It might be that you can fund me, Aidan, and Dave getting a codex. Also, we have Saltire Games. They provide a range of disgustingly resilient branded gaming tools, things that can help you measure contagion ranges, charge distances, deep strike, stuff like that. So check them out. There's normally also a link in all our videos. And Vanguard Tactics isn't I'm affiliated with Team Stonehammer, but Aidan and Dave are very much Vanguard Tactics affiliated, and Aidan is of course a Death Guard coach. So if you are wanting to, if you listen to this video, you think there's some interesting points, but you want to go even deeper and speak to someone who's genuinely good with the faction, obviously Aidan's your man, and do that via Vanguard Tactics. He's a coach there. We also have some disgustingly resilient podcast branded merch, so t-shirts, hats, things like that. The 11th cultist t-shirt where Aidan famously went on stream and accidentally put an extra cultist in one of his squads, plague bus, stuff like that. It's all the stuff that people love and know for the channel. Someday we might get a War Dog Will one, but that's that's not there at the moment. And yeah, I think that's all the plugs. But again, I'll try and respond to comments from my personal channel below this video. So if there's anything that you wanted to ask, of course, feel free to do so. I'm unlikely to be sharing the list that I've talked about in this video on there, because the point isn't necessarily the list. This isn't like one of Aidan's videos where it's like, this is the list, it's how it plays, it's really good for these reasons, give it a try yourself. This is what works for me. The point of this video is find what works for you and then practice with that list. Try not to get caught up in the Death Guard meta, as it were. Just because someone else is doing good with one list doesn't mean that's going to translate to you. And if you want it to translate to you, by all means, get the models, put the time in, put the effort, get good with it. That's one thing I was saying before. Maybe I should do that with the Plague Storm list, but because of the limited gaming time I have now, I don't think I want to do that, because I think the time required and investing, I think there'll be, to have that learning curve, I don't have the gaming time to do it. Whereas if I was getting 2-3 games a week, maybe I would. But anyway, thank you very much for listening, guys. If you've made it all the way through, this has just been one man's stream of consciousness into a microphone. This is one single take, so I'm proved I can definitely talk. But thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.